So without further ado, I'm going to bring up Bobby Murphy. Bobby is a economist, no, socioeconomist, sociologist. What do you want to call me? Okay, social scientist at the New England Fisheries Science Center in the social sciences branch. He's also on the Scallop PDT, and he's been very valuable to us as a new member of the Scallop PDT. So, Bobby, take it away.
How's this? Can folks hear me okay in the back? All right. Yeah, thanks, Travis. Yep, so my name's Bobby Murphy at the Northeast Fisheries Science Center. I guess I'll apologize up front. I'm not going to be talking about sea stars. Although maybe in a roundabout way, I might touch on them. So I'm relatively new to the center, only about almost a year. It'll be a year in January. So a lot of this is pretty new to me, but thankfully there's some folks at the center that have been doing work on scallops for quite some time. So I'm not an economist. I sort of dabble more in the sort of sociology, anthropology world of social sciences. Thankfully, I have some economist friends at the center, and they were kind enough to share with me some of their great work that's been done over the last handful of years. So the first couple of things are some pretty hardcore econometric analyses that I'm certainly not an expert in. So if there are questions, I'd be happy to direct you to those people that did that work. I will touch on, however, a project that I did prior to coming to the center, where I got to work with the scallop fishery as well, and a number of other fisheries, where we sort of looked at the fisheries' perceptions of risks and their own ability to adapt to those risks. So first, quickly touch on a project, and I will also caveat, we need more of this type of information and these type of things. A lot of the economic work that's been done at the center sort of stopped in 2018, 2019, just because of capacity constraints and people getting pulled into different things, people retiring. So this is definitely something I'll say this at the end too, but we're all ears. We'd like to hear from you all about questions that are interesting to you that you think really deserve research attention. So this was work done by John Walden and Minyang Lee back in 2021, and they were essentially trying to dissect profitability in the fishery. And so they looked at the fishery from 1996 to 2015. And I'm going to do a couple definitions just to get them out of the way. They sound technical, but they're really not. So total factor productivity index is just a measure. It's a relative measure of how much output, so landings, you get from some particular amount of inputs, so days at sea, for example. And then the second one, terms of trade index, was an index they calculated that's really just looking at the output price you're getting for scallops compared to the price that you're putting in to generate that particular level of output. And so what were those inputs? I'm only mentioning a few here, but they looked at a number of attributes of the vessels themselves. So the mean length of those vessels over time, and a lot of this is not going to be new to you and probably pretty self-explanatory. Vessel length went down over time. Horsepower has gone down over time. I know it's probably hard to see these in the back, but the end of that time series ends in 2015. Mean age of the vessels, not surprisingly, going up, so getting older over time. And then days at sea dramatically declining from 1996 to 2015. Capital costs, so sort of those one-time costs, or typically one-time costs of running a fishing business, seem to have gone down over that time period. And then the daily costs have really fluctuated a lot in that time period. So those are some of the inputs that went into this economics model. And then the outputs, pretty obvious. Premium and market scallop mean pounds, so how much you're actually getting out of the fishery, and then ultimately the revenue that's being generated from those scallops. So as you can see, while there was a decline sort of towards 2013, 2015, mean scallop revenue seemed to increase over that time period. So now putting this all together, here's a plot of these relative indices. So that dark black line is going to be profitability. That's what we care most about, right? We have this kind of broken into three time periods, the effort control period, then this transition period to spatial management, and then ultimately this spatial management regime. So then we have the sort of big dotted line. That's the TFPI. So that's output landings compared to inputs. So days at sea and all those other input variables that I mentioned. The small dotted line is output price compared to input price. So when you look in the beginning, that time period of like 1998, this transition period up through like 2003, 2004, you see that profitability goes up substantially, although the terms of trade index, so that's prices, didn't seem to improve very much. That increase in profitability, at least according to their analysis, was largely driven by fishermen getting more efficient, better at catching scallops. However, this sort of changed in the latter period of this analysis. Thankfully, profitability kept going up, but the reason for that was a bit different. And again, this is probably pretty self-explanatory and obvious to a lot of the fishermen in the room, but it's an important conclusion that profitability went up, but in this case, the outputs relative to the inputs actually went down, but you're getting a better price for those scallops. You see that small dotted line increasing towards the end of this time series. So why is this important? And I'm going to emphasize this throughout this presentation, but we don't know how scallop enhancement will change this equation, will change profitability. And this is the type of thing we'd really love to hear from you all. Is like, what are the research questions? What are the economic questions we need to be looking at so we understand what scallop enhancement could do to the profitability of the fishery? So even more briefly, I'll touch on this paper by Greg Ardini and Min-Yang Li from the Northeast Fisheries Science Center, who also used some econometric modeling. In this case, they were looking at the potential effect that the IFQ program had on price and revenue. And so all of this is in reference to, or so they're referencing the IFQ fishery to the limited access fleet. So the limited access fleet was serving as a control for these models. So this plot you see here on the right is simply the price that the IFQ fishery is getting relative to the LA fleet. Again, not surprisingly, you see that sort of dip in IFQ fishing during the transition period, or the price that they're getting relative to the LA fleet, and then a pretty dramatic increase in the price that the IFQ fishery is getting relative to the LA fleet. And so why is that the case? So this is a plot here of the different size categories of scallops, and we're comparing all of these to 11 to 20 size classes of scallops, and you'll see that there's generally a premium, not surprisingly, on those big U10s, but that premium has been pretty variable over time. See sort of the opposite of that, a discount to the smaller scallops, and obviously it's the worst with the smallest scallops. But what's most important, I think, about this plot is when you look at the end of this time series, 2014, 2015, the differences in prices are getting dramatic. And I actually have a figure with some more recent data to show that's still largely the case now. But what I think is really important about this and how it relates to scallop enhancement is when you think about this in the context of what's happening globally. You're likely not going to be able to see these figures on the right here, but I put a plot, or I put a table that shows just the relative production that the U.S. is contributing to the global market. It's incredibly small, right? In 2016, it was around 6% of global production of scallops writ large. And then you can see in this plot in the bottom right, this is just the ratio of exports to imports. We're exporting a lot of scallops. So the question is, what is driving all of this? There's probably a lot of things driving this, but number one, consumer preferences and sort of perceptions of this system, consumer demand, and international markets. These are things that are largely out of our control, but can have a potentially large effect on these price premia and how much profitability is coming from the scallop fishery. So to conclude that project, I sort of talked briefly about some of these conclusions. But they found there was sort of a small effect of the IFQ program on prices, but relative to revenue writ large, it was pretty small, about 2.6% increase to the IFQ fishery relative to the LA fleet. And that price premia has grown substantially over time. But when you look at, this is more recent data of the different size categories and the prices they're yielding per pound, that red box is highlighting the U10s more recently. And again, this is not news to anybody in the room, but prices are incredibly variable, right? And we suspect that a lot of this is driven by demand, consumer preferences, and international markets. Although I'd be really interested to hear from others in the room that probably have a lot more personal information and hypotheses on what's going on here. Okay, so now to some of the work that I did that is not in the economic world. But so prior to coming to the Northeast Fisheries Science Center, I worked over in Alaska at the Alaska Pacific University. and was lucky enough to work with 5 really diverse fisheries from across the U.S. We worked with 3 North Pacific-based fisheries and 2 in it's mostly New England, so groundfish and the scallop fishery. And first, we did what was a really labor-intensive effort. Thankfully, we had really motivated grad students who went through many hundreds of council documents, fishery management documents over the course of about 3 years. Also went through news sources like National Fishermen, Saving Seafood, et cetera, to find instances of the fishery or representatives in those fisheries expressing concern about really anything. It could be environmental concerns, ocean acidification, warming waters. It could be regulatory concerns. It could be wind energy development, anything. So then we put those together. We went back to the fisheries themselves. Some of those folks are in the room. Thank you, Mary Beth. And we asked them, do we get it right? What did we miss? So through that effort of that literature search and through focus groups, we put together what we're calling like the risk portfolios of these fisheries. And you can see scallop's actually pretty unique. So this plot is just showing when you put all of those concerns together, the proportion of them that are in each of these categories. So scallop actually expressed the most concern for environmental risks relative to some of these other 4 fisheries that we worked with. That included things like ocean acidification, microplastic pollution, climate change, predators. These are all things that we've kind of talked about in this workshop. Okay, so what do we do next? We then sent a survey around to as much of the fishery as we could. And so for scallops, this was largely focused on the limited access fleet. And we predominantly got responses from like Massachusetts. So this is not indicative of the perceptions of the entire fleet, but is somewhat of New England limited access fisheries vessels. So what you see here is on the y-axis is how much concern people expressed for these different risks or different threats. And I just want to note that even though some of these things show up further right on this plot, meaning they had lower levels of concern relative to these other things, they're still really important because people either brought them up in focus groups or we identified these things in public comments, public testimony, and other management documents. So, and then these are color-coded by sort of the category of concern. And you actually can't even see the color of the box plot for number 1 because literally everybody that responded to the survey thought it was the most concerning risk, and that is offshore wind energy development. Probably not surprising to everybody in the room. I was surprised at the sort of unanimous decision of survey takers to tell us that that was the most concerning risk. Some other things that made it really high up on that list, Title II, the Ocean-Based Climate Solutions Act, that's 30 by 30. Both of these things obviously are like further constraining the spatial access of the fishery. This was really interesting, poor fishing practices. So fishermen in the scallop fishery were talking about high grading and other sort of not optimal or not efficient fishing practices that were ultimately affecting the fishery in a negative way. Increasing operating costs. So those economic models I showed you before, they're changing. I caveated all that with it stopped in like 2015, 2016. We need new models. We need new information. We need to hear from you about how your operating costs are changing over time so we can better understand the consequences of these changes. That's also a call to my colleagues to, if you get a request to fill out the cost survey, that information is vital to those models. And here I think is kind of where the rubber meets the road and what I'm really interested in helping to understand. And that's sort of these social parameters that I don't know that we've talked about a ton. Granted, I didn't get to listen to all of yesterday, so perhaps we talked about it a little bit. But I think what happens in the public sphere, the public domain, is going to be really important. So one of the concerns that was demonstrated by the fishery was keeping up with sustainability certifications. That's a really important consideration. And also the public perception of the Atlantic sea scallop fishery. Granted, this was sort of lower on the spectrum, but this was a few years ago, or 2 years ago. So I imagine, this is my own hypothesis, I imagine this would probably change or perhaps been elevated in concern if I did this again. I think this really circles back to the idea of scallop enhancement is that we really need to understand proactively how the public is going to respond to enhanced scallops. I don't have the answer to that. I wish I did. I don't think anybody can anticipate how the public writ large responds to these things, but I think it's something that's worth considering. Here I said I wasn't going to talk about sea scallops, but I think it's important, and this isn't a trivial thing to say, it's important to think about how the public would even think about sea scallop or sea star removal. That could be potentially perceived in a negative light unless you get ahead of that and think about how to position it in a really positive way. Compost, sea star compost for scientific research. I say it sort of jokingly, but I think it's a non-trivial thing to think about. I mean, we'll all see what happened with like Monterey Bay and the lobster fishery recently, right? If you get blacklisted, that can really affect your fishery. So to wrap up my presentation, sort of talked about these things a little bit, but all these fisheries had very different risks. Some of them were the same. A lot of people were concerned about bycatch regulations, increasing spatial constraints. But the scallop fishery was really the most, was more concerned about environmental risks than these other fisheries. Thankfully, however, I didn't show the results for this just because I don't have much time, but we asked people that took the survey sort of their own perceptions of whether or not they could adapt to these things if they were realized. And the scallop fishery did show sort of the most resilience compared to these other fisheries. So I think that's like a positive note from this is despite all these changes, it seemed in that work that the scallop fishery believes they can be resilient and adaptable. And I think that is sort of shown true here. So getting this really diverse group of people in the room, people are forward thinking and thinking about how to adapt to these changes. Okay, so to kind of wrap this up, I hope I demonstrated that these market and economic considerations are going to be really important in thinking about scallop enhancement. How potentially does a new product in the marketplace change consumer preferences, change international markets, and can you do that in such a way to actually be favorable? And finally, the future is, as we know from hearing our talks today, is highly uncertain, both from an environmental perspective, but from a social perspective. These sort of social norms about preferences for seafood are incredibly dynamic. I think Mary Beth and others that work in Alaska can say that's certainly the case. Over the last handful of years, trawl fisheries have gotten a really bad rep and have really suffered from sort of the public perceptions of trawl fisheries. And that's, so I didn't show those results, but for one of the Alaska fisheries, or two of the Alaska fisheries that we worked with, that was their number one concern, was public perceptions of trawling. That is what they're most concerned about. And I think that's a really critical thing to think about, especially as you're potentially bringing a new product to market. So again, I guess I'll end with sort of a question. What questions are important to you? As a relatively new scientist with the center, my research portfolio is wide open. And I'm really keen to hear from you about what types of questions are most interesting and could potentially inform what I think is a really important discussion that we're having here today and yesterday. So I'll stop there, and I think I maybe have time for a question or two. Maybe not.
Let's give Bobby a round of applause here. We do have time for a few questions for Bobby. So now's your chance, really, because the plenary discussion will be a little different later this afternoon. So microphones.
Hi, thank you so much. Right at the end, you said that the scallop fishery seems more resilient. Are you pulling that from the surveys that you did, or what made you say that?
Yeah, so I wish that I had more chance to go into that. So we used a pretty commonly used index in social science. You just ask people about sort of their perceptions of the future and their profession. And so we did that with all the fisheries. And the scallop fishery sort of demonstrated the highest perceptions of resilience. It wasn't that much different than the other fisheries, but I just put that bit in there to show that I think if anybody can do it, if this fishery can adapt. But yeah, that was coming from our own surveys. So everything but the last part's currently in review. The economic work, that's all out there. And perhaps I can share that with Dave and others, and I can pass that along. Yeah.
And that's also a plug for looking online on the website where I know people did abstracts. And I'm not sure if that will be there, but if it's not there, that's where BIM's website, we can put that on there. So there's a QR code on your table. And a lot of references are in those documents that people put together from yesterday.
So I would just ask, is this continued from 2015? Can you get data or going forward?
It's not continued to this extent. This was depending on which one you're interested in, I doubt that the IFQ analysis will continue, but I think the questions about sort of profitability in the fishery are obviously relevant always. We're having discussions now internally about seeing those through, but like I said before, it's really a capacity constraint because there's only so many economists at the lab, and we get pulled in a lot of different directions. But I do think there's a need a need to update that analysis. I don't have a good answer though whether or not it will be. Oh, I will add to that though, that was a pretty advanced econometric model, but a lot of that could come from fishermen as well. As a social scientist that doesn't do economic analyses, there are other techniques that are a lot easier and faster by just talking to people that we could do to sort of highlight some of these changes as well.
So just a quick question, and I should know the answer, but I forget. So the work that you shared, which with the different fisheries, and certainly you indicated, as you indicated, I participated in that process. What was the final year when you went through your, interviews and all that sort of thing, when you were speaking to people in those fisheries, that brought us through 2021 or 2022?
We did surveys in the end of 22, beginning of 23. So anything that happened after like January 2023 is not captured in here. But
The reason I ask-
we would have done like the focus groups with you. That would have been earlier in 2022, like winter.
Right. So
So yeah, anything that's happened since then, and we've talked about this in other capacities
it
here.
just feels like a lot has happened since then.
Right.
Which is what prompted the question, and certainly resiliency within the fishery, I think is probably, we do get a different answer today. So that's why I was sort of looking for that.
Totally.
timeline. So it makes one think in terms of, your broad range of comparative, North Pacific, Northeast type thing. You're probably not going to be ongoing on that, but where you're now in the region, since you have some metrics, maybe going forward, it'd be something worth tracking.
No, that's a really good point, and I'll emphasize that I added that in kind of for you all. Like I think it was an interesting finding too, and we ended up changing the analysis a bit. But one of the other things that came through is the scallop fishery was the most optimistic. That was 2022, 23. If we
it's
did that again, I'm not sure.
Yeah, and
Yeah.
just one thing to think about, if you have more time to sort of focus on a single fishery like scallops, is that, like the economics, clearly that's the broad scale for the entire fishery. Within the fishery, there are sectors that have, the economics are different, and you highlighted some of that through the IFQ, but a lot of it was clearly not broken down for good reasons. And then even, for something like resiliency, again, if one had the ability to spend more time within a single fishery, looking at it from a different perspective, regional, mid-axis versus not, all those different variables would be interesting. Possible.
Yeah, no, that's a great point, Mary Beth. Thank you.
Thanks for your talk, Bobby. It was great. Just a similar question for the I guess concerns part. When going through council documents and public reports and outlets, over that time frame of which you looked at it, did you see concerns shift in time, or was that examined? Like, for example, I'm curious if environmental concerns increase with the rate at which we're seeing changes on the water, or has that level of concern been static over the last 10, 15, 20 years?
It's a really good question, one that we thought about. and unfortunately I can't answer because, so we hired a grad student, this is a chapter of her dissertation, who started doing this digging, slit review. And we very quickly realized how labor intensive it was. So we pretty quickly put a timeline on it, and I'm gonna get this wrong, but it was like 2018 to 2020. It was a pretty short window, just because of the sheer volume of things she was going through. I mean, it included like audio recordings, like everything. So we didn't do a time series. One of the outcomes of this was essentially that what you see in the management arena or even in like news sources isn't necessarily perfectly matching what, and this is kind of obvious in this room, but doesn't necessarily reflect all of what the fishery is concerned about. And so that's one of the outcomes of this, is just to reiterate, like, we need to be working together and talking, because what shows up in the management cycle, what shows up on national fishermen is not everything. And these things are synergistic, right? All of these, that was kind of one of my takeaways here, I hope that I communicated, was that there's a lot of other things happening that we need to be thinking about. But I don't have an answer to that, but I think a future effort, using AI or something